Hey, Lioness, welcome to the show, Lioness Conversations, where we help women be brave, to lead with confidence and joy, and to find your path to the most meaningful work of your life. I'm your host, Jen Porter, leadership and empowerment coach for ambitious and heart centered women. Today, we have a very special guest, Rachel Tenpenny McGonigle. Rachel, founder of The Grief Gal, transformed her own unimaginable loss into a powerful path of healing, empowering thousands to navigate grief and rebuild their lives with purpose and joy. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank
I want to give the audience just a little bit of background about how we came together. So, you were nominated as a lioness by a dear friend of ours. And you and I connected first when we did the book interview because I'm writing this book, the Lioness Project, and I got to hear your story. And I knew by the end of that conversation that I wanted to share your story more broadly. And so I want to just give a preview to the listeners that this is a tender topic. This is one we're going to be talking about grief and loss and overcoming and how to find your way back to a place of dare I say, happiness, joy, meaning, purpose. And the thing that I have carried your story with me. I carry everybody's stories with me, but yours has a weight to it because of what you've experienced and how you are now empowering others to move beyond their their pain and their grief and to dare to dream for something that seems impossible, which is to move forward after such immense loss. Um, the what else to say? The other thing that really strikes me is that you have a unique ability to say hard things in a very tender place that people are holding in a way that they can hear and be challenged by and move forward. Not everybody has that gift. And so you dropped some wisdom bombs the last time that we talked. And it was like, wow, wow, wow. So I want to prepare people for what they're going to get to hear and experience through your story. Thank you for being here. Mhm.
Not that I don't still miss my girls because I absolutely do.
Mhm.
But my life is very full. I do something very meaningful that I am passionate about. I have, you know, a loving husband now. I went through a divorce, so that is another topic. But I have a
Mhm.
loving husband now, a blended family of four boys that keeps our lives very full. A one-eyed dog named Nala, who is also keeps our lives very full. And there was just a time in my life where even though I fought for it and I wouldn't give up on it, I wasn't actually 100% sure it was possible.
Mhm.
And to move forward 17 years later, of which a vast majority of that has been incredibly fulfilling and full of
Mhm.
healing. I just wish somebody would have told me this 17 years ago.
Mhm.
That's what I wish. And that's why I
Yeah.
do what I do, so that somebody can be a different voice than the voices that I had, which were the voices of a mother who loses children will never be okay.
Mm. Yeah. So let's share with the listeners what your story is. I want to because they're probably wondering like, what? Oh my goodness, what happened? I'd like for you to share the loss that you experienced, and then I want to move us to how it is that you're helping people today. and then we'll go back in time. But share what the losses are that you experienced.
So in 2008, I had two little girls, twins, that got sick and died 6 days apart from each other. Um, they had ultimately they shared the same symptoms of what happened, but it all happened in different order. So we were navigating two different journeys for two little girls. I also had a 2.5-year-old son at the time. We had no awareness that anything bad was coming. It was just normal life, right? You have a baby, and then that baby gets a certain age, and you decide to have another baby, and surprise, it's two babies. And so now you're preparing for two babies, and then both of those babies die. And I found myself thrust into a world of grief and loss that I never saw coming. I had no idea how to navigate. And quite frankly, I didn't like it at all. I didn't like being there. I didn't want to be there. I felt forced against my will to be there. And I was incredibly disappointed with what being there meant. It was antiquated. I feel that we still have a culture that, even though grief is universal and has been happening since the dawn of time, people still act like every loss is a giant shock and surprise and treat you like you're the first person to ever grieve. There's a big hands-off approach to grief, right? It's your own journey.
Yeah.
Everyone grieves their own way, which I always felt was really code for, can you figure it out yourself and please don't bother me with it. And
Mm.
once I started putting it together that the culture in our society was not going to magically shift to make my grief easier for me,
Yeah.
I was going to have to find my own way. And it's not that I have had no help or nobody showed up along the way, but when we experience a significant loss like that, if we're expecting someone else or something else to come and save us or make it easier for us, we will wait forever.
Mm.
It's hugely disappointing to realize you have to advocate for yourself.
Why do you think it is that our culture doesn't accept or look grief in the face?
Because
What's
it's
happening?
terrifying. It's
Yeah.
terrifying. It's your worst nightmare realized in someone else.
Mm.
You know, I would walk into a room after Aubrey Nellie died, and it was full of wonderful, kind people, you know, women that I went to church with or had play dates with. And they would walk out or they would look away because, one, they didn't want to hurt me. They thought if their babies were around, it would somehow make me more sad that my babies
Right.
weren't. I don't think everyone has terrible intentions, right? We're just very confused. But also, you can't be holding a little baby and then look at the mom whose baby's just died and not think about losing your own child.
Mhm.
Just like you can't be a wife and sit with a friend who just lost her husband and not think about what it would mean to lose your own, or any kind of loss, right? We have a friend that loses their parent. We immediately think, oh my gosh, losing a parent would be terrible if we haven't lost ours yet. And so grief is this unfortunate reality that slaps us in the face that says it's not just someone else. It could be you. And it probably will be you eventually because we all go through loss and we're not ready for that. We don't want to make space for that in our lives. And part of it's because we get a lot of messaging that makes us negative or paranoid or there's something wrong with us.
Mhm.
But also the other side of it is we are taught how to acquire things, but we are not taught how to lose them. So our
Mm.
loss skills are low. And whenever we have a low skill set, it's uncomfortable. We want to avoid the things that we know we're not very good at. So grief is just hard. Bottom
And
line.
that leads to what you're doing now. One of my objectives for this podcast is to share stories of women who have overcome tremendous things and are now using what they've been through to give back to others in a way that is meaningful and having impact in the world. And your story is that. So it takes so much courage to do what you're doing.
Okay,
So
so I have a
yeah.
different perspective on that.
Okay. Tell me.
I do think it takes courage. I think lots of things take courage. I think it takes
Yeah.
courage to do what you're doing. Um, but I think there's always a certain point in life where our courage starts tipping over more into our passion. And the things that we used to be really afraid of or were really hard, where we had to really conjure up that bravery to push ourselves through,
Yeah.
we get enough practice under our belt where we're not terrified all the time, right? That's why
Mhm.
it's so important to do hard things, right? To even when we're afraid, to do it anyway and to cultivate courage and bravery, because eventually courage and bravery also becomes proficiency, and which
Yes.
becomes passion. And I don't wake up and do something that feels hard to me every day. Was there
Mhm.
a time in my life it was hard and I had to push through that and I had to learn? Yes, but it was a season, it wasn't forever. Because there's no way I would have the capacity to face that level of fear every single day of my life forever. I'm a
Yeah.
human being. I have limits, right? I can't push myself to the edge of my limits like that all the time. So I had to learn how to cultivate that proficiency. It's
Yeah.
exactly what I taught myself to do after Aubrey Nellie died. Everyone said it's impossible. The pain is too great. You'll never be okay. And I decided that I was not going to allow grief to be a limiting belief or a limiting experience in my life. That there's no way that grief could set a cap on what I was capable of. I was going to be the only one who would be limit what I was capable of.
What
And so
was it what
I'm
was
sorry.
it inside of you that gave you the gumption to believe and hope for more?
So a big part of it was having a beautiful 2.5-year-old son that I wanted to have a good life. I wanted him to have happy memories and
Mhm.
a childhood that wasn't plagued by paranoia and grief and a broken mom who was always, sad or at the very worst, bittersweet. I wanted him to have fun holidays and good birthday parties and normal days after school where we just got a snack and we fed the dog and then we did homework and right. And our life was not umbrellaed, right, by this
Mm.
constant grief. Um, but also underneath that, because I've thought about this a lot and I've thought, was my son enough? He was a huge part of it, but he wasn't enough. It went all the way back from when I was young. And my best friend and we had this mantra. We were um like we love living. We're pretty carefree kids, but we also took everything very seriously, right? We wanted to be good people and we wanted to grow and learn. We were traveling around the world at that time doing missions work, and we always worked hard and we talk about all these deep, we thought we were so deep in um everything, we were ordinary teenagers, right? And it wasn't that we thought we were better than anyone. We just everything mattered to us. And we had this mantra together. We would always say, if you don't know what to do, choose life. And that's how we would figure out, like, if we don't know what college to go to, if we don't know, what was the most life-giving option.
Yeah.
And which was fun and wonderful at a time when, the worst thing in my life was that my parents made me pay for my own stuff. I couldn't do whatever I wanted to do. Like I did not understand a lot about grief and loss in my early years. It
Okay.
just really wasn't a part of my life. And the little bit I did was very distant from me. It was many degrees removed. And when my girls died, even when they were dying, even when they were sick, I would repeat that mantra in my head and try to match every decision to what is the most life-giving decision.
Wow.
Now that takes on a different meaning when now you're old enough to realize that there's difference between quantity of life and quality of life. So I was able to process that. And then when they died and I lost both of them, I made a promise to myself that I would choose life in their absence, right? In their stead.
Mm.
They didn't have a chance to choose life, so I will do it for them.
Wow.
Um, and that meant that life couldn't be only about their death. It had to also be about their existence, right? Their value, their meaning. Um, and so I'm feisty like that. And I make up
Yeah.
my mind. I make up my mind.
Mhm. Mhm.
It felt too important. And it felt the cost would be too great. I'd already lost so much. The cost was already unfathomable. I just
Yeah.
wasn't willing to give anything else up that I had the power not to, right? Some things are not in our control, but me deciding if grief was going to become my identity or become something that informed my identity was in my power. I did not get a chance to choose if my girls lived or not, but I could choose how I was going to respond. I could choose to be the mom I wanted to be to my little boy, right? And so those choices became how I empowered myself, even when I didn't have all the other answers that I needed, and a lot of stuff still didn't make sense.
What were you hearing from others? You talked about the unhelpful responses that you got from people around you, well-meaning but not helpful. What kinds of things? Because I think we can all relate to
Sure, but
this.
there's thousands of them. But
Yes.
the big ones were a mother who loses a child will never be okay. Um, Other people said things to me like, it's a blessing in disguise because if they couldn't be okay, they're better off in heaven, because they were going to have health problems if they lived through their injuries. Um, People said things like, you need to trust God's will, right? This is God's will, which I did not find helpful at all because it did not align with my understanding of who God was or the scriptures that I had read, that God's will is never that innocent babies suffer and die. That's actually completely opposite of his will. It was a horrible, tragic thing that happened, and it had very much to do with living in a broken world, not living under God's will. And and you can deep dive into some pretty serious theology in that area, and I often do,
Mhm.
because one of the best, let's go with best advice I got.
Okay.
The best advice I received was from a friend of mine who was a mentor to me through my teen years. And I called her and said, I'm not sure where to go from here. I don't know how to navigate this. I'm not even sure what's real anymore. And it wasn't that I was having a crisis of faith. It's just that when you go through a loss like that, all of the filters are skewed now. You're wondering, how do things really work? What do I really believe? What can I really depend on? What am I really in charge of? Where do I have
Yeah.
control? Where do I not have control? So lots of deep, like, existential questions. And I said, I just don't know where to go from here. I don't even know what to trust, what to believe. And she said, well, when you don't know what's true, the best thing to do is keep peeling back the layers, right? The first thing, you're like, I'm not sure this is true anymore. The second layer, I'm not sure this is true. And she says, just keep peeling back what you're not sure is true. It doesn't mean it is, and it doesn't mean it isn't. It just means you're not sure until you land on the thing that you know that you know that you know is true. And she goes, go as deep as you need to go until you hit that bedrock. And as I did that, and it wasn't something that happened in like a minute, right? This was a process I took myself through for like a couple of months to just keep peeling back. What is real? What is true? How do I know? Do I know? And I was able to land real hard on the bedrock that God is good. I don't know how he works. I'm not even sure he listens to all of our prayers. I still have a lot of questions, a lot of things I haven't even sorted through 17 years later. But I couldn't deny that I had experiential proof, okay, not just cognitive awareness or scriptural information, but actual experience from my own life of God's goodness. And if that is something I know that I know that I know to be true, then that became a filter that I looked at everything else through. So if God is good, how can it be his will? Because
Mm.
a good God does not see two little babies as expendable for some greater good or lessons the rest of us need to learn. And that's when I realized God was grieving with me. So if God
Mm.
is grieving with me, he knows grief. But grief is not God's identity, which means grief can't be an identity. It's an experience.
Oh, say that again. Grief cannot be an identity. It is an experience. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay, that's big. And I'm guessing that's what a lot of your clients struggle with.
Well, it's the primary message in the grief world, right? Grief,
How so?
once a griever, always a griever. Grief changes you. Grief
Mm.
never leaves. You just learn how to carry it.
Okay.
Right. And then you hear weird contradicting things. And this was the stuff I was sorting through pretty early on. You hear the message that once a griever, always a griever. And then you hear psychological terms like prolonged grief.
Hmm.
And I'm going, why is there a term for prolonged grief, which is essentially the idea that lasts extra long and is extra intense, if we're being told that grief is permanent?
Huh.
Once you grieve, you always grieve.
What does it look like when we have taken on grief as an identity?
So when we really sort of put on the coat of our grief and absorb it into who we are, grief becomes either our excuse or our limit in anything we do.
Okay.
I'm this way because of my grief. I'm not this way because of my grief. I'm not capable of this or that, right? Because of my grief. No one understands me because of my grief, right? We just sort of put this banner because of my grief over everything in our life. And it's the best possible excuse we could ever give ourselves to not push through our pain and tap our potential, because it's
Mm.
also the most justifiable excuse. Nobody pushes back when you say, "You don't get it. I lost two children. You don't know what I've been through." And they say, "You're
Mm.
right. I don't. Your grief is yours. It's your own journey."
Yeah.
Right? I'm one of the few people in this grief sphere who pushes back on that and says, if grief is your identity, that's because you chose it to be.
See, this is the thing that you share that is probably really hard for people to hear.
Sometimes it is, but other times it's the hope someone is looking for. Because
Mm.
there's
We're
also this
ready for it.
backlash in the grief community that if you don't want grief to be your identity and you want healing in your life,
Yeah.
you're a big giant betrayer,
Oh, like you're
right?
leaving the group?
Yeah, well, or that your loved one is not being honored because your pain honors them.
Okay.
And then
Yes.
healing means forgetting or loving less. Or I had a woman come up to me at a conference I spoke at, this was years ago, and in front of many, many people in this group, including one of them being my sister, she said to me, if you loved your girls as much as I loved my son, you could never heal.
Oh my goodness.
And it was very jarring experience. It was not easy to hear that because I felt she was basically accusing me of not loving my girls
Wow.
and, all the way. My sister even said to me, she says, I do not know how you didn't start crying. And I know exactly why I didn't start crying. Because what I saw wasn't a woman who was trying to jump down my throat. I saw a woman in so much pain.
Mhm.
She didn't know how to love her child and let go of her pain.
Right.
Right? And that's when grief becomes our identity, when we say, I need this pain to prove my love. So I will absorb this pain so that my loved one is never forgotten, is always
Yeah.
honored, right? But I teach that our loved ones are more honored in our healing than they ever could be in our hurting.
Say more about that because in my mind, I'm thinking about the relationship between pain and grief, and then the human experience of pain and what we do with that. And you're talking about honoring. So just tell us more about how did you navigate this yourself, and how do you help other people navigate their grief, their pain, and what love and honoring can look like.
So, first of all, I want to be very clear that we are absolutely entitled to our pain. Grief is an incredibly painful experience, and there's no glossing over that. You can only go through and processing that pain, understanding where that pain is coming from and what it's rooted in, why it's there is a very important part of the process. And believe it or not, it's way deeper than I loved them and they're gone. That's
Mhm.
just scratching the surface of the depth of our loss and therefore the depth of our pain.
Yeah.
But when we start to really examine why our pain is so deep, what we often discover is not that our love is so deep, it's that our identity is so intertwined with that relationship that we're struggling with who we are without them,
Yeah.
right?
Mm.
All healing work is identity work. And there's mixed messages about we grieve in proportion to our love. That's not what I have seen. That was not my experience. I've been doing this for a very long time. And I don't see people grieve in proportion to their love. I see them grieve
Mm.
in proportion to how clear they are in their own identity.
Oh my
The more
goodness.
confused they are about their identity, the deeper their grief.
That
Because
is
it's not just
huge.
about love, because people have healed from grief, me being one of them, right? I have healing in my life, and I still love my girls more than what is measurable. So if my grief was about my love, I would still be grieving.
It's so interesting for you to hear you talk about identity being connected to grief, because the foundational work that I do in coaching, we always start with identity. Because if we don't understand
Everything
who
starts
we
with
are,
identity.
we
Yes.
can't build on that. We always start with identity. And I've not thought of it from the standpoint of the intertwined relationship and our identity being attached to that. And it feels very natural, doesn't it? Especially, I would imagine, with your children.
Absolutely. And it's not that we shouldn't have our identity intertwined in these things, right? If we
Mhm.
lose a parent, or when we lose our parents, really,
Yeah.
like they are the primary influencers of our existence. So we should be intertwined with them. They should mean something to us. Without them, our lives should look different. But we should also know who we are because of them and who we are without them. Because if we're not who we
Mm.
are without them, right? And I hear this all the time, right? They were my world. They were my everything.
Right.
That's whenever I hear a client say that, I'm like, all right, we've got some deep identity work to do. Especially when I
Yeah.
hear parents say that about a child they lost when they have other children. That's always a tricky one to unravel, right? This one child was their world, their life, their everything. And these four other children are trying to navigate
Mm.
essentially what they mean to their parents, and
Yeah.
grieving their sibling, and some pretty heavy things. But answering those questions, who am I because of this person and who am I without this person? So whether it's a parent, a spouse, a sibling, a child, when we can answer those questions with clarity and honesty, then we're unraveling our identity from them. And now we're grieving from our identity instead of for identity.
Wow. I want you to share more, because I have found in my coaching experience that when we start to peel back those layers of our identity, even just to imagine ourselves not attached to anyone that's important in our lives, there is it's disorienting,
Mhm.
right? There's a fear that can come up. We almost aren't able to go there because it feels, one of the greatest fears I think that people have is being alone. And so if we're not tethered to anything, that becomes really scary. So how, like, I'd love to hear, what are some examples of how do you help people understand their identity without the the one that they've lost?
Sure. So what we first really dive into is, so I start very practically, and actually we dive into just your basic like personality profile testing.
Mhm.
We really just examine like, what is this natural God-given personality that you have, because we want to have that baseline to start. Like these are just sort of the building blocks of you. And then we start examining those things through the lens of loss. But we don't just look at it through the current loss that brought them to me. We actually go all the way back as far as the furthest unresolved loss in their life,
Hmm.
because we're always working from the point of our furthest unresolved loss, because it means we have filters that every other loss is being viewed through, because we have yet to resolve that furthest,
Makes sense.
right? So we
Mhm.
look at that, start there. Um, and then, you know, human beings are not meant to be unattached. They're not meant
Right.
not to be bonded or connected. All we're trying to do is make sure that we have the skills and the perspective to rebond if a bond is broken, and
Hmm.
understand who we are because of that bond and who we can be without that bond, so that we're capable of forming other healthy bonds, so that we can keep moving forward in a healthy community.
Mhm.
right? Like those are the three areas that we look at: physical health, emotional well-being, and relationships. Those are the three areas I focus on most when we're healing from grief. So, and then sometimes we sprinkle in some additional things, but we start there. That's the foundation, because we aren't who we aren't who we are without relationships.
You know how when we go through something really difficult, even I'll get like at counseling as an example, when we choose to surrender to a process where we hope we can find healing, it when we're in the thick of it, it's super scary, and the pain is so intensified because we're focusing on it that we often will flee. Right? We just want to escape that. So is this a situation where it's hard before it gets better, like it actually gets worse before it starts to get better? Is that an
Yes,
experience that your clients have?
yes, absolutely. So that's a very interesting question, because most most of the reason why people even contact me or find me is because they've been through a very difficult loss experience. They felt a lot of pain, and they've actually tried other things first. They've
Yeah.
gone to talk therapy, they found a support group, they went and talked to a pastor, they went on a retreat, right? They did something,
Mhm.
and it isn't helping. They're feeling like they're going backwards. It's not getting easier. And now they're starting to wonder, is it just up to time? Is it really true that grief is forever? Right? They're starting to have these questions about the permanency of their pain.
Hmm.
And they come to me and they say, can you help me even though I've done all of these other things?
Yeah.
And I reassure them and say, yes, I can. And also, it does get harder before it gets easier, but this is why. We have to go in the right order of support. We have to get your physical body supported under the toll of your emotional pain, or
Wow.
any well-meaning emotional work will not stick because it's not being built on a
So you
foundation.
you address the physical health
Yeah,
first.
first. Yeah, foundationally across the board.
And are people willing to do that work?
They are.
Because
We need to give
these are
them a really
individuals who
practical, yeah, really
they're
practical
ready for
care.
healing, so they're listening to what you're telling
Yeah,
them.
they are, but I also think that oftentimes grief work starts immediately with a lot of psychological and philosophical ideas. And when we are really deep in grief, our brain actually changes and the electricity gets really stuck down into beta waves. And beta waves are not the kind of brainwave that allows us to have philosophical or future thinking.
Mhm.
It keeps us locked down in very much survival mode. Like, what's the
Yeah.
next thing? Keep yourself safe, eat a little bit of food, get some sleep, right? And so telling grievers things like, you won't always feel this way, or it will be okay, literally bounces off their beta brain. Can't even absorb it because they're just not even in that capacity.
Okay.
So what I do is get them set up on those very practical things that don't require decision fatigue. They are not philosophical, in nature, and say, we're just going to eat warm food. We're going to protect our sleep. We're going to take adaptogen herbs to help regulate your central nervous system. We're going to make sure we're going to get your B vitamins up. We're going to build up that depleted foundation so that our brain, right? I put them in a T ritual. The T ritual changes those beta waves into alpha waves.
What kind of
Alpha.
teas are you talking about?
So I created a line of teas. That was my first company, but
Mhm.
any teas will work. Any organic herbal teas,
Herbal.
superfood, green tea, anything that's delicious to you will work, because the tea itself offers a ton of nutrition, but what really seals the deal is the ritual. It's
Huh.
walking yourself through the self-care protocol that they teach you, where you steep the tea, you hold it, you smell it. It's all about grounding. You're grounding yourself, you're
Yeah.
regulating your central nervous system. So then when you ask
So
yourself three
simple.
very important questions, which are, what am I feeling? Why am I feeling that way? And what action step can I take to meet my need? You actually can get data from that because you've regulated yourself and you're no longer competing with your beta waves and your adrenaline.
Incredible. Incredible. You're talking about some really significant somatic experiencing, like psychological experience, like counseling. There's so much involved in what you're sharing, but it's a very simple way that you're introducing it to people through tea.
Yeah, I think yes. Yeah, tea changed my life. Tea was probably the single greatest factor of shifting my grief, other than Yeah, I don't even want to say other than. Now, tea was not a magical cure for my grief,
Hmm.
but it was the ritual and the nutrition that I leaned on to continue to strengthen myself towards the next tiny step. And then I
Yeah.
take that step, and then I take another cup of tea, and then I take that step. And my tea ritual enabled me the longevity and the consistency I needed to make progress in my pain.
Wow.
And I think it's completely underutilized, and it's the foundation of
Yes.
everything I
Yeah.
teach.
Did you, so you start with your clients with the physical. Were you aware when you were in the intense early stages of your grief and loss that you needed to supplement your physical health? Were you in that
So, some
awareness?
degree, I always was, and just luckily, because I was raised that way. I was raised in a home with a lot of natural and alternative medicine where we were
Mm.
taught that our bodies and our health and all of that are connected and you need
Okay.
to take care of them. So I had some basic understanding of that.
Mhm.
But right away, other than that I was recovering from my C-section, I I didn't understand how much support I needed to give my body. To I tried to run my grief out of myself. So I was attached to the physical aspect of my pain in the sense that I needed to get it out rather than build it up. And
Mhm.
being that in my background, I was an athlete and I, you know, like to push myself and right, it was a default mode to say, I can beat this, right? I can get through it. Exercise is good for
Mhm.
you. It'll help me feel stronger. I need those endorphins. I'll strengthen my body back up and I'll get myself through this. And there was a lot of messaging at the time about how to use exercise as a tool to get through
Okay.
grief, which exercise is hugely beneficial, but it has to be in the right context. It needs to be
Yeah.
restorative. What I tried to do
Yeah.
was more like self medicate, right? And what I discovered is, I started my poor son. He was so little, and I used to stick him in the jogging stroller with a snack and a sippy cup of water and run for hours. And that kid would
Oh.
just chill out in the jogger like such a champ. But what I learned was started out as 3 miles, turned into 5 miles, turned into 6 miles, turned into 12 miles. Like I was just, then I started competing in half marathons. You know, I just couldn't, I just couldn't win, right? I couldn't beat my grief. It was always waiting for me.
Yeah.
And then
Wow.
what started happening is I was depleting myself. I wasn't eating what I needed to eat. I couldn't keep that adrenaline high for very long. It was interfering with my sleep. And that's when I realized that I was not helping myself. I was just distracting myself, right? Because
Mm.
medicating our way through grief doesn't have to be the obvious drugs or alcohol. It's not the only way we
Right.
medicate. I happen to choose exercise. it was
Well,
it's a misguided choice.
yeah, I'm glad you shared that. Um, I'm thinking about the tea, and I know the tea, you describe it in a healthy, like it's a tool, it's a ritual. Um, I also think it's just a healthy coping
Oh
mechanism too,
yeah, absolutely. Well, just,
right?
tea in and of itself is a superfood. It's one of the most powerful foods we have on the planet. It's been used for centuries. It has no side effects, no poor benefits, like
Right?
the only beneficial thing. It boosts your immunity, it's anti-cancer, it's delicious, it's super affordable. There's a billion different varieties and flavors for all different needs. You can adapt to it seasonally. All you need is water to make it. Like it's
Amazing.
the easiest thing you could ever do. The biggest return on investment you can give yourself.
Yeah.
Then when you get more mindful about it and you move from like a tea bag to an actual loose leaf tea
Mhm.
experience, you integrate that ritual with all of that nutrition. And now you have something incredibly powerful in your
Do
life.
you still have does the tea company still exist?
It does. My sister still has it. So we started it together in 2009. And then I left in 2019 and she took it
Mhm.
over exclusively, got a new business partner, and they've absolutely launched it to the moon. So
Can
Tea
you
Motions
share
is
what it is?
it's
Because people may wanna get
sure.
quality
It's
tea
called,
after
yeah,
hearing you.
Tea Motions.
Tea
Tea Mo
Motions.
teamotionstea.com is the website you can go to. And there's 6 different flavors.
Teamotionstea.com.
Each one has a unique blend of adaptogen herbs for a unique emotional support benefit.
Mm,
They're all delicious, award-winning, organic, non-toxic, no additives, no preservatives, not even any sweeteners, no anything. They're amazing.
amazing. Amazing. So after the physical, where do you take your clients next?
Then we start going into the identity work. Then we
Okay.
work on emotional well-being management, building a support system, understanding yourself and what you need, getting clear on those two questions. Who am I because of my person? Who am I without my person? We dive deep dive into that identity work. And then from there, we move into actually assessing the relationship itself. We look at all the
Mm.
significant factors of the relationship. We do what's called I call it a timeline, where we look at the entire relationship, highs and lows, goods and
Yeah.
bad. We analyze what that meant to us. And ultimately, it leads to a 14 prompt letter called a culmination letter, where we complete unfinished emotional communication and give our heart a
Ooh.
voice.
Yes, I love that you said that because I do that in my coaching work. The way I ask it is, if you gave your heart space to speak right now, what would it say? Because we're disconnected, right? We're always up here and we're not allowing our heart to give it voice.
Mhm. Yeah, and I believe in completion. I don't believe in closure. I think it's a horrible term,
Hmm.
very confusing to
So you
people.
believe in completion, not closure.
Closure. Because closure insinuates that we can compartmentalize the things that impact us most from our life, right? We can
Mm.
process them, stick them in a box, and then be done with them.
Hmm.
Where completion says there's no compartmentalization, there's integration. And we have to
Yeah.
integrate these experiences into who we are and then carry them with us instead of dragging them behind us.
Wow, that's good. You mentioned support. You help your clients kind of create a support network. What did your support look like when your girls died and thereafter?
So, in some ways, I had some phenomenal support. Both my sisters were very much there for me. My mom, especially now, my mom, she is probably my biggest champion as far as honoring the girls. She gets them a present every Christmas, something for their birthday.
Mm,
Um, just just keeps them very present, but not in like a dramatic way. Just like, when people ask her how many grandchildren she has, she includes them in the number,
yeah.
right? My dad does not do that. My dad includes the number of living grandchildren. And at first, my mom, she would ask me if that bothers me. And I said, no, it doesn't bother me because I believe that you each have your own choice to decide how you are going to tell the world about Aubrey
Mm,
Nelly. And
okay.
my mom is at a place where she's very comfortable telling the world about that. My dad likes to vet people a little bit more and not bring them up as much, right? That's his choice. It's not
Mhm.
because either of my parents love them more or less or anything. They have just integrated the loss of their grandchildren into their life differently, which is exactly the whole point, right? You get to make your own choice and it's authentic to them and it's honest. But Aubrey and I are still very much a part of our family, a part of our life. But my mom, my sisters, I had a couple of pretty amazing friends come out of the woodwork. I think the biggest challenge for me was I did not have support from my husband. We had a very challenging marriage. We are now divorced, but we just couldn't. I had this naive ideal that because our marriage had been hard for quite a while. So when Aubrey and Ellie came along, it wasn't like a big shocker to me, and losing them, it wasn't like, oh, I had no idea. I knew our
Mhm.
marriage was hard, but I had this belief that if life ever got really hard, we would be able to band together and get through it. And
Yeah.
then life got really hard and we did no such thing. As a matter of fact, we really just went our separate ways. Because I was like, I don't have the capacity to try to keep um, wooing this relationship, right?
Yeah.
Holding space for this relationship, whatever you want to call it. I'm barely getting out of bed in the morning. So, you just have to tend to your own grief.
Yeah.
And, you know, so one of the things you actually said that I wanted to address is before we even got started, you were talking about how lots of couples don't survive the loss of a child.
Mhm.
Well, my experience over the last 17 years and my research has shown that lots and lots of couples get through the loss of a child. That losing a child does not break a marriage. Losing a
Mhm.
child reveals if a marriage is broken,
Yeah.
right? It's a magnifying glass on what
Yeah.
is in need of healing.
Mm.
And couples who are tight, who are, no one's perfect, but when they're solid, then that magnifying glass doesn't show any cracks, right?
Wow.
But when you have a lot of cracks and you've been coping with them with other coping strategies because you haven't been
Mhm.
grieving, but then now you are grieving, all of those cracks get
Are
magnified.
exposed. Mm.
Yes. And you no longer have the capacity to kind of work around them and brush them under the rug and tolerate them because your bandwidth is gone. You're barely getting through it.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened to us. It just completely exposed that there was serious issues and struggles in our relationship. And I went into, you know, my ex-husband decided to go to graduate school and basically buried himself in that and disappeared that in golf and work. He was also a Marine at the time. And I pulled back for my own survival to take care of my children and to not try to solve all of that because I just didn't feel I had the
Mm.
capacity to do so. And 10 years later, I left with two little boys living 2,400 miles away from family to start as a single mom to get healing finally from that situation.
Yeah. I'm curious about what stage were you at in your healing 10 years later? Do you remember?
I was pretty far because I remember I was very strategic about how my marriage and what the timing of it. And I had a lot of clarity, and clarity is evidence of healing. It, the more clarity we
Ooh,
have, the more healing we have. If
okay.
we're still not clear, it means we're still in the process of healing or
Wow.
sometimes haven't started. So that's part of the reason why there was a decade between the loss of our girls and the end of our marriage is that it did take me some time to get my footing.
Sure.
But once I was able to get that clarity, I strategically moved through it. And there were highs and lows. It wasn't like there were some rough patches, but I promised myself that I was not going to end my marriage out of panic or out of desperation or out of exhaustion, that I needed to have that clarity, or else I would question my choice for the rest of my life. And someday when my
Definitely.
children ask me about what happened between me and their dad, I want to be able to answer them um, with confidence, with clarity. It's not that I don't think that they're going, those answers are not going to be difficult to hear, but at
Right.
least they won't see a mom who thought something then and isn't quite sure now and would do it differently, or like it's not
Mhm.
solid. And I
One of the things that you mention in what you shared with me in writing is that you're very intentional, you're very purposeful, and you are about empowerment. And that's what I hear in that. That's so important when we're making decisions, that we're making it from a place of wisdom and intentionality and not just a knee-jerk response or reaction to what is so hard.
No, it's the only way to, and not that you can't recover if you do make knee-jerk reactions. There is still
Sure.
healing there too. But when decision, and I see it's not just, in a difficult marriage, whether it's after a loss, like when I see people in pain,
Mhm.
the need, the desire, the risk factor of making knee-jerk decisions is incredibly high because that's what we're programmed to do when we're in pain. It's to get out of it,
Yeah.
right? You have to train and discipline yourself to stay in your pain and choose to collect data in order to make informed decisions, right?
So I'm with you on that. And I've learned over years to coexist with my pain. In a way, I'm not scared of my pain anymore. I used to be. But I'm guessing that a lot of people listening are afraid of their pain. Can you say what makes it worth it to stay in the pain?
Sure. Well, so first of all, if we're listening to the false narratives that our pain is forever or our pain is permanent, then it's much easier to be afraid of our pain because
Okay.
our pain feels more powerful than we are. And we're afraid of things that we don't think we have power against, right? Like
Yeah.
that's why when we see, a giant wave coming, where it's like, that wave is way bigger and stronger and more powerful than me. And we see, a little tiny poodle
Mm.
running towards us. We don't freak out because we're like, I'm way bigger and more powerful and strong than that, little tiny prancing
Mm.
poodle. Right. So we're constantly making these gauges, like these assessments, like, how afraid do I need to be of something that is bigger and stronger than me? And so if
Yeah.
we're told, well, grief is bigger and stronger than you, loss is bigger and stronger than you, right? Trauma is bigger and stronger than you. Then we're
Mhm.
terrified because we're like, it's going to get me and it's going to take
Right.
all my power. So we do weird things to try to maintain a sense of control or whatever we
Yeah.
can. And so first we need to change our narrative. Your pain is not more powerful than you. Your pain is data. It's telling you something and you need to listen. And the minute you start listening, the minute that big, overpowering, stronger than you
Mhm.
pain goes right back down to being its normal, manageable self because it's
Mm.
like a 2-year-old. It will throw a tantrum until you pay attention to,
Gets attention.
right? And
It's
figure out what
interesting
it's trying to tell you.
that you share the wave analogy because in my own healing journey, one of the things that was a game changer for me, literally changed my life, is when I realized I used the metaphor of when something huge comes, I would see it as a wave, and the wave would overtake me. And I used to think in the intensity of the emotions around it, in those moments, I didn't think I would recover. Like I didn't think I could come out of it. And what shifted for me is I could see the wave in my mind, and I realized I had actually learned as a child how to dive into the wave in the ocean
My
so that
dad
it
taught me
doesn't
that too.
crush me.
Yeah, I've used that analogy because it's real.
And I so I it was like deep within me I realized, oh, I actually have a tool that allows me to navigate the wave. I'm not afraid of the huge waves coming and crushing me because I have ways to manage it, and that the wave will come, but it will pass. And there'll
You're
be
going to have
another
to
wave that
swim and hold your
comes.
breath, but it won't be more powerful than you.
Yeah. And so that there was something that happened in this was somatic experiencing work that I was doing where whatever part of me realized that. And I've never gone through tough things the same.
So I had a pivotal moment like that too. And it was actually something my dad taught me. When I was in the 5th grade, we went to Catalina Island. Our whole class would go on this big field trip. They did it in all the schools in California. And you go stay a week on Catalina Island in the Marine School. And
Wow.
you do very cool things like snorkel and look at plankton under microscopes and learn how to read the stars and, catch sea cucumbers and release them back into the ocein and,
That's
whatever.
amazing.
Yes, it was awesome.
I'm thinking
And
of the field trips I went on, and it was like to the local waste management company,
oh,
it's
pales in
nothing
comparison.
like
Like
that.
not the quiet life, teaching events there. But my dad, we were getting all ready to go snorkeling, and my dad came as a chaperone, as he often did because he could manage some of the more unruly kids. So it
Okay.
would always be like me, my dad, and a group of like, monkey brained boys, right? As we're all trying to like go on, have a fun field trip. And so we're getting our wetsuits on, and while we're getting ready, my dad says, "Hey, just in case you get caught in a riptide, don't panic." He says, "You have a wetsuit on, it'll keep you buoyant. It'll also keep you warm. We're all going to be in a group. So if for some reason you start getting swept away, I will know. I will see you." He taught me the hand signs, what all the stuff to do. He was a lifeguard, right? And he said, "We will get out to you, but just don't panic because it's the panic that will make you drown. The panic is what exhausts you. The panic is what, muddles your thinking. It is going to feel like it's taking you way far out, like further out than you can ever imagine. But it will eventually let you go, swim
Wow.
parallel to shore, and I will come get you, or I'll come get someone to come get you." And I was like, "Okay, Dad, sure. Glad. Thanks for telling me." Sure
Yeah.
enough, snorkeling around with Ryan Escalante. He was my snorkel buddy. And we're snorkeling, we're looking at the Garibaldi fish and the sea kelp and all this stuff. And I lift my head up, and the group is way over there, and we are way over here. And immediately I went, we are caught in a
Oh
riptide.
my gosh.
And immediately I said, okay, my dad said, don't panic, right? So I waved, I saw my dad give me the hand signal, right? And I was like, okay, he sees me. Of course,
Mm.
Ryan Escalante had an absolute panic. Like the kid lost it. And I remember being in the water and saying, you can't panic, you're gonna drown, like snapping him out of it. Realizing that like my dad had given me a plan. No
Wow.
one had given Ryan a plan. We compose ourselves, we start swimming parallel to shore. I'm telling you what, we swam forever. That thing took us way the heck over there. But sure enough, we got to shore. And when we were walking back, my dad was right there to meet us, just like he promised. We got out sooner than he could get a flotation, like a paddleboard to go get us. But we ended up, anyway, long story short, what I learned from this, and this is what I pulled from this in my grief is a lot like being caught in a riptide. But having a plan is how you get out of it, not by being the strongest swimmer. Right? And when we start developing the freedom to allow ourselves to create plans, right? Whether that's a skill set that we need, right? Just like, because we were taught, my dad used to take us to the North Shore of Hawaii and we'd go swim the giant waves at Waimea Bay. So he taught us how to like get in and get, because if you didn't, man, you could break your neck, right?
Yeah.
Like those things were big. And then sometimes I wonder, it's like, why did our parents let us do that? But now I know, because they were trying to cultivate courage, right? And confidence and all these important things in us, and me and my
Yeah.
sisters when we were kids. But I pulled from that we don't need to know everything. We don't need to be the strongest. We don't need to be the most courageous. We just need to be willing to remind ourselves, I can learn a plan. I can execute a plan, right? If I dive in and say, what's next and how can I help myself and what do I need to know? Then I can execute that plan in my life. And when Aubrey and Ellie died, that's exactly what I looked at myself in the mirror and I said, I don't know what to do, but I'll figure it out. And my whole life became the plan to get me through my pain. And that plan changed and it
Yeah.
evolved, and I didn't always execute the right plan, right? I learned a lot along the way, but we don't need to know 1,000 steps ahead. We just need to know the next step. And that's what I think is missing in grief culture, is this whole everyone gets to their grief their own way, everyone grieves uniquely, is basically saying you don't need a plan.
And
And
that
I
you're
just know
alone.
you do. Exactly. You do need a plan. It isn't just yours to figure out. Other people have gone before you, and
Yeah.
some of us have learned some really valuable and important things. And even if our grief differs and our pain differs and our loss differs, the way we heal is shockingly universal.
What kind of results do you see for your clients?
Amazing result. It's the best thing ever. Someone asked me the other day, how do you do it? How do you just work with grievers all day? I said, I don't work with grievers all day. I work with people who are trying to heal, and I get to watch them transform. We don't just sit around talking about how miserable and hard it is, although we have plenty of vulnerable moments. My clients are allowed to be honest with me. I know how hard it is. They know how hard it is. We talk about it, but we don't stay in that place. We also make plans. We also interject skills. We also access resources. We learn how to set boundaries. We give ourselves permission to ask for help. We change our nutrition. We grow in our self-awareness. We implement our self-care plan, right? And I'm watching them learn and grow. And they come to me and they say, I'm not even sure this is possible. I'm
Yeah.
just, and I always tell them, borrow my hope. You don't have to know.
Mhm.
I know,
I would
right?
think they would get, because that's something that we get from people who have gone before us in a hard thing that's similar to ours is hope. Because we see, oh my goodness, they've survived this.
Yeah. And it only has to be true for one person. One
Hmm.
person has to have healing in their life after loss for healing to be possible for anyone.
Will you share that story of the dear friend who you kind of made a vow together early on that you would believe for the impossible?
I think that was the same girlfriend who helped me dig through like the layers of what I
It
didn't
might be, but
know.
she was dealing with throat cancer.
Oh, that's Amy. That's
Will
Amy.
you share that story?
Yes. So her and I met. I put on a retreat called Retreat Hope, ironically, in 2014, and she came as one of the attendees. And she was one of the first people I met. We just hit it off immediately that talked about grief and loss like I did, that healing was possible. And she wanted that healing. Her daughter died when she was 31 days old, I believe. And I was her firstborn daughter. She's gone on to have two boys. I have two boys. Like we have some similar overlaps, but in different ways. But we just bonded in that commitment that we would honor our children more in our healing than we would in our hurting. And we would honor the life of our daughters more in our healing than we would in our hurting. And we were not going to let anyone intimidate us or bully us or shame us into healing less so that we could prove how much we love our
Wow.
girls.
And at that time, I remember you saying you believed the impossible because you
So
didn't
we,
really
yeah, so
think.
we, I don't know if we believed it yet,
Okay.
but we refused to allow anyone to tell us that it was impossible, right? That grief made
Mm.
something impossible. We're like, what is grief? That powerful? Like grief is now the decider of our fate and our future and our
Mm.
emotions and our inner world? No way. I was just not going to hand it over that power, and neither was she. And by the way, her name is Amy Lands. She's amazing. She's written numerous books. Find her, glean from her.
Yeah.
She's amazing.
And you mentioned that grief, I think that you said grief is finite, like grief can end, like we shouldn't, we don't have to, we can choose to move beyond grief. Can you say more about that? Because I'm not sure that everybody
People hate when
realizes.
I say that, by the way. That's probably the thing I get yelled at for the
How do you
most.
say it?
I do say grief is not forever. I say that.
Grief is not
Yeah.
forever.
Well, I actually say grief doesn't have to be forever if you don't want it to be. That's what I say. Right? You have a choice. You get to decide what goes on in your internal world. Your heart is 100% your responsibility. We cannot always choose what goes on in our external world. Other people's choices, what happens that we can't control, the weather, circumstances, you name it. It's not always in our power. Actually, rarely ever is it. But what happens inside here is 100% up to us, to the extent that you could even put a gun to my head. You could even take my life, but you couldn't tell me, Rachel, you better hate your children right now. You could never make me decide to hate, decide to love, decide to be, to forgive, decide to, right? Those are only things I can do
Mm.
in my inner world. And grief is the same way. A loss
Mhm.
experience can take from you a loved one, but it cannot take from you your ability to decide what happens to your heart. So if you want a life of healing and beauty and hope and richness and meaning, you can have it because you can choose it. And if you want a life of pain and limited thinking and suffering and anger and resentment and blame, you can have that because you can choose it. These things do not happen against our will. Losing my daughters happened against my will.
Mhm.
I couldn't stop it. I couldn't change it. I didn't cause it. But what happens to my heart, I only get to decide that. And if I don't like what's happening to my heart, I can pick a different outcome. Grief does not have that power. It's not what gets to
Yeah.
decide.
I find that one of the most powerful things, the most empowering thing, is when we create choices for ourselves. If we feel like we don't have a choice, then we become trapped and powerless, and that's what you're inviting people
Yeah, and you
into.
hear it a lot in grief. People will say, especially, there's unfortunately some really upsetting platitudes and cliches around grief. And one thing that grievers do not like to hear, and I understand why, is when people tell them, oh, you're so strong, right? You're
Okay.
so strong. Because they know that maybe they don't feel strong. Like, I don't know how strong I am, right? Maybe I'm strong, maybe I'm not. It doesn't feel that way. But also, oftentimes the response is, I didn't have a choice. And I always gently correct my clients into, yes, you did. If you're
Hmm.
getting out of bed every morning, it's because you chose to.
Yeah.
If you're not getting out of bed every morning, it's because you didn't choose to. And maybe that's a good choice, right? Maybe you need more rest or something, right? There's no
Yeah.
judgment. But if
But
you
let it be a
chose to go to
choice.
work and pay your bills, if you still choose to show up for your kids or your husband, if you choose to get through the day, if you choose, right? These things are your choice because you have other choices. You could check out, you could opt
Mhm.
out, you could stop taking care of everyone, you could do a whole bunch of things. But just because we had a difficult experience does not mean that we didn't have a choice in how we showed up for it.
Another thing you say is that we are more powerful than our pain. Can you explain that?
The bottom line is, if it were true that we're not more powerful than our pain, then what are we doing? Because it means we don't get a say in our lives and we're just waiting for fate or happenstance to take over.
Hmm.
There would be no pursuing healing. There would be no hope. There would be no growth. There would be none of those things after loss if our pain gets the final say. Because now we're saying we're powerless in all of this. And I do not believe in powerlessness. That is my top message. We are not powerless, even
Mhm.
when situations, right, take things from us.
Yeah. So how do you honor Aubrey and Ellie now?
I'm happy. My life is good. I love what I do. They're integrated into everything, right? Their life is more meaningful than their deaths, even though
Mhm.
Ellie only lived for 7 days and Aubrey for 13 days. Their life is still more powerful than their death. And I think that's my biggest message in grief is we have to remember to represent for their life, the life that they live, the life
Mhm.
that they gave, the value of that life, not just their death, and let death define us and death control us and
Mhm.
death determine our next steps because we want to choose life, and it's actually been interesting how I am in a place that I wasn't sure I ever could be at, but I definitely wanted to fight for it. I didn't
Mhm.
ever want to look back and say I didn't give it my best. That
Mm.
was another promise I made to the girls. I said, if they can see me, and I don't know if they can, if they can see me, I wanted them to see a mother who was fighting for a good life, to love her son, to be a good mom to their brother, right? To show up as a good sister and, to
Mm.
see life as still a privilege to be lived and honor them that way instead of see me fold and give up and use their death as an excuse for why your brother wasn't loved as much as he should be and why life didn't go the way that it should. Because I thought, wow, if my girls see me use them as an excuse, how is that honoring?
Mm.
How is that loving? And again, like I said, I don't know if they can see me, but if they can, I wanted them to see the version of me that wasn't afraid to fight.
Wow.
And fight I did. But the amazing thing was is I didn't have to fight for very long because it turns out that healing is an incredibly powerful transformational experience that lets a lot of good in relatively quickly. You don't have to struggle for decades in order to finally feel an ounce of reprieve.
Hmm.
It's not diminishing returns, it's exponential returns.
Incredible. Before we wrap up, I want to share the different kinds of losses that you help people with because it's not just the loss of a person, a child, a parent, a spouse, but it's other kinds of losses. Can you name some of those just so people have a sense of the things that you help people with?
Sure. So there's two kinds of loss that cause grief. And the first kind of loss is when you don't get to keep something you wanted. Okay. And then the second kind of loss is when you realize you're never going to get something you always wanted. Right. So those are future losses. So for example, someone who's struggling with multiple miscarriages or has not been able to get pregnant, that's real loss. You can't point to, right, an actual loss of a, well, in a miscarriage, you can point to the loss of a baby. But even in infertility, right, you're not getting there. And a loss of a future, a loss of a dream, a loss of a hope, like those are real losses. So I work with a lot of intangible losses. I also work with what they call ambiguous loss, where there's loss involved in something that doesn't seem bad or hard or painful. So empty nest syndrome, right?
Mm.
The sale of a business, retirement, things where people think they're moving on to something good or the next phase, and then they're disoriented and emotionally distraught, lost, they've lost their purpose, whatever it is. I work with that. And then I also work with, for example, like athletes who their career has ended from an injury, or someone fell and now they're paralyzed and illness has changed their life, right? Things that are permanent changes or transitions that are difficult to
Yeah.
navigate. So if it's the loss of a person, the loss of a relationship, I work with a lot of people who've experienced a divorce, um, or even parents who have children that struggle with addiction. So they're pretty much not part of the family, right? And they're grieving that, even though, people don't have to die to be grieved. And,
Yeah.
really, if you can point to a situation that is either a loss experience or a difficult to navigate transition, you can call me. I can help with all of those things.
And you're currently helping a lot of California residents who went through the wildfires.
Yes, I am.
That's a lot of loss.
Yeah. Losing your home in a fire is a lot of loss. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, it's very misunderstood loss because it's easily invalidated with, at least you're still alive,
Mm,
just stuff.
right.
And yes, it was stuff, but it's important stuff that is attached to people's memories, their histories, their identities. It's incredibly difficult to recoup all of those things. So there's no such thing as replacing those losses. You
Right.
actually have to grieve them and build a new
Mm.
life. And you also have to do it while people sort of judge you and say you're losing perspective and being superficial. So that's not fair to people. So
Mm,
it's very important when you are grieving to find, I think this phrase safe space is overused at times, but grief requires safe space. You need a place where you can feel your feelings, express your emotions, talk about your thoughts and confusions without feeling judged or diminished or having to compare your loss to others in order to
yeah.
get the validation that you need. Comparison always tells me that a griever does not feel seen. Comparison is just used
Wow.
to say, please understand how much pain I am in and how significant this loss is to me.
One of the things that stood out to me in our first conversation was at the end, I said, "Hey, thank you for sharing your story with me." And I thought to myself, you probably share your story all the time. Do you remember me saying that? And you said, actually, I don't. I don't, because it's not helpful. It's helpful for people to know you've been through something significant, but then it invites this comparison of, well, you've lost two babies and maybe they've lost one. And it's just, there's nothing helpful about
Right.
the
I
comparison.
share the generic, like my 4 sentence story, right?
Hmm.
But the nitty gritty of,
Yeah.
because my story isn't just losing my girls. My story is
Hmm.
also navigating a difficult marriage, also going through a divorce, also starting a business that I loved, and then leaving it 10 years later and going through that, starting a new business during COVID when it's the worst time in the world to start a new business and trying to keep a roof over my children's head. Getting in a new relationship, meeting a wonderful man, and now being a stepmom and having a blended family. Like, there's so many layers, right? Grief is not my story. Grief is a
Hmm.
part of my story. It just was so significant that I knew that if I did not treat it with the seriousness it deserved, it would become my story. And that's what I
Wow.
didn't want.
Incredible. So how can people find you? And if they reach out to you, what can they expect? Can they talk to you? Can they ask the questions?
Yeah, if you reach out to me, you'll get me. So you can email
Okay.
me at rachel@thegriefgal.com. My website is thegriefgal.com. And if you send me an email, I answer you back personally, and I will answer whatever questions you have. And more importantly, I will likely set up a call with you where we'll do a free consult where I'll spend about 30 minutes understanding a bit more of what you're experiencing, what you
Mhm.
need, and then that way we can figure out what the best steps forward are for you next.
I'm so thankful you're doing this work. People need this.
Oh, I think so many people need it. I think there's going to be a grief support revolution, and I'm going to lead it
Mm, yes.
because everyone grieves. The world is full of grievers. And
Yeah.
you don't have to experience trauma to experience grief either. Not everyone is traumatized just because they've grieved. And so grief is
Mhm.
very misunderstood because it always gets put into the trauma category.
Mm,
But grief is a permanent thing, it's a permanent part of being human. Everyone will grieve. It's not an if, it's a when. And statistically speaking, the average person will grieve 8 significant loss events in their lifetime.
yeah.
So people will grieve more than once. So these skills, these resources, these tools are essential to meaningful living. And we need
Mm.
to normalize them. They need to be accessible. This isn't like just therapy isn't enough.
I could see
Lost
it being
skills are vital.
beneficial to, us when we're going through grief, but also to be there for others when they're going through grief and having more tools to be able to support others.
Absolutely. And we can pay attention and we can get some of those tools. But when we go through our own lost experience, it does expand our empathy in
Mhm.
enormous ways. And the
Yeah.
best thing we can do to show up for people is to just listen, right? Just be there, be present, pour them a cup of tea. That's why I always say, like, I don't know what to do. Pour them a cup of tea. It's the best thing you can do for them. You
Yeah.
don't have to fix them. You don't have to alleviate their pain. You don't have to solve their problems. Just be present.
Hmm. I'm so glad to have met you and that you're doing this work, Rachel Tenpenny McGonigle. Thank you for taking time and sharing. And um, yeah, I'm so glad that I know about the work that you do because there are people in my life that are grieving. I'll be grieving things in the future, and it can be all consuming and just a very isolating experience to go through. So yeah, everybody reach out to Rachel. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
In the meantime, the lioness in me sees the lioness in you.